Thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It is a great pleasure. When I first moved to the United Kingdom in late 2001, having spent the last months of my parliamentary career, in inverted commas, under protective surveillance in South Africa, it was great for me that quite literally within weeks of arriving, I received a call from Anne at CAT asking to meet to discuss the South African deal and to discuss campaigning work in the United Kingdom. I've always been extremely grateful for that outreach from the organization and for the continuing support and cooperation I get from CAT, including in the form of a single share in BAE that enables me to go to the annual general meeting every year. What I'd like to talk about is the South African deal from the perspective of somebody who was in a sense sitting on the other side, to give you an indication of the sorts of impact that the arms trade has on democracy, not just in the United Kingdom, where I would argue it profoundly undermines the strength and vigor of the oldest parliamentary democracy in the world, but also on the democracy in the countries to which the arms are sold. In 1994, when the ANC came to power, we had committed ourselves, and with a background in economics and finance, I had worked on this for a number of years before we came into office. We had committed ourselves to reducing defense expenditure, which under the apartheid regime had been the highest annual expenditure line item on the South African budget since the advent of legalized racism in 1948. In the mid-1980s, when the anti-apartheid struggle within the country was perhaps at its height, 14% of South Africa's GDP was spent on defense. And it was our commitment to reduce defense expenditure in favor of the much needed socio-economic spending on so many aspects of South African life. However, at the same time, there was an acknowledgement within the ANC, not uncontroversial, but there was an acknowledgement that there was the requirement for some modernization of the South African National Defence Force, which was formed after the merger between the Apartheid Defence Force and the armed wings of the various liberation movements. The public process took place with a great deal of civilian participation in Parliament to review the defense needs of the country in those early years of democracy. This defense review identified modernization needs to allow South Africa to play a meaningful peacekeeping role in sub-Saharan Africa that would cost just under 8 billion South African rands, a not insignificant amount, but one that the civilian participants in the defense review felt was acceptable. By the time the arms deal that Sarah made reference to is concluded in 2018, when the contracts and the payments end, it would have cost the South African government and the South African people in excess of 100 billion rand. So we went from just under 8 billion rand to over 100 billion rand. How did this happen? I'm going to use just one of the contracts, the largest, which was the contract that BAE and the Swedish company Saab were involved in, to give you some indication of the way in which this happened and some sense of the consequences. One of the needs identified by the Defence Force was the need for new jet fighter and trainer planes. Now, the need in and of itself was highly controversial because at the time that tenders were sought, there were still 15 unused jets that were sitting in hangars at an airfield outside Pretoria that the South African Air Force had never used. Notwithstanding that, a technical committee made up primarily of Air Force personnel identified from the 9 submissions that were received from 9 governments, including the BAE South option, which was identified as one government, even though it was actually the British and the Swedish governments. There were 9 bidders for this particular contract. The technical committee of the Air Force drew up a shortlist of 2 of those 9. BAE South were not on the shortlist. And the reasons for that were quite simple. In the first instance, the proposal from BAE South, which included both a trainer jet and a separate jet fighter, unlike any of the other offers, didn't meet some of the basic technical requirements of the Air Force and exceeded some of the other technical requirements, but exceeded them in such a way that the Air Force felt that the technology on these planes would actually be problematic and make it more difficult for South African pilots to learn to fly the new equipment. Not incidentally, the BAE South option was 2.5 times more expensive than the plane that the South African Air Force's technical committee had identified was their first choice. A jet fighter and trainer produced by the Italian company Aeromarchi. The shortlist from the technical committee was taken to something called the Arms Acquisition Council, which was chaired by the then Defense Minister, Joe Modise, who in exile had been head of the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, and became the first democratic defense minister in South Africa's history. At that meeting of the Arms Acquisition Council, Modise exploded. He demanded to know why the BAE South offering was not on the shortlist. The reasons were explained to him. He insisted that the technical committee return to the drawing board and come back to the Arms Acquisition Council with a shortlist that included BAE South. They did so. Unsurprisingly, it was third on the shortlist of 3. When it returned to the Arms Acquisition Council, the minister and his political advisor, a gentleman by the name of Fana Hlongwane, had what was later described by the presidency of South Africa as a visionary moment. On this, the single most expensive transaction that the democratic South Africa has entered into in its 15 years of existence, the minister and his sidekick decided to exclude cost as a procurement criteria. Now, this was obviously because the BAE option was 2.5 times more expensive than the option that the Air Force wanted. But even with this extraordinary intervention by the minister, BAE were only second on the shortlist. So another visionary moment was required of the minister. And this time, he decided to increase the weighting of the economic offsets on offer in each of the bids. And he went to BAE and South, and he told them to produce, as a matter of urgency, a much improved economic offset offer. That invitation was not open to the other 2 bidders on the shortlist. Now, I'm sure that most of you sitting here understand the concept of economic offsets. They're used on a huge number of public procurements, almost without fail, on every arms deal that has ever been done. An exhaustive amount of academic and campaigning work has been done on economic offsets. They basically posit that if you buy $100 worth of armaments from a particular company, that company will invest an almost equivalent amount into the buying country's economy, both in relation to the arms purchases, but also in relation to unrelated economic activity. In the case of the South African deal, BAE came back with the remarkable proposal that for every $100 the South African government spends on its jets, the company will invest $109 in the South African economy. Now, the international literature suggests that less than 10% of these offsets are ever realized. And the reality is, what all arms companies do is they build in the cost of penalties for not delivering on their offsets into the purchase price, which is exactly what BAE and Saab did in the South African case, increasing the price that was charged to the South African government by 35% over what was charged to, for instance, the Australian government. So, the minister's second visionary moment was to increase the weighting of the economic offsets and to give BAE Saab the opportunity to make a far bigger offer than they had made initially, while not giving that opportunity to the other bidders. And with that sleight of hand, the BAE Saab option just came out in top in what was by now, from the perspective of my Public Accounts Committee in South Africa's Parliament, a completely discredited process. And on that basis, in an informal meeting held in Durban between President Thabo Mbeki, Defense Minister Modise, his political advisor Hlongwane, and two other cabinet ministers who were sympathetic to the minister's viewpoint, an informal decision was taken to give BAE Saab the contract. The head of procurement in the Defence Force at the time, a gentleman by the name of Chippy Shape, then took the minutes from that meeting, took them to the Secretary of the Defence Force, and said to him, "I'd like you to sign off on these minutes as formal minutes of a meeting of the Minister's Subcommittee that is empowered to make decisions on this transaction." He refused to do so. The meeting nevertheless gained the status of a formal meeting of the Ministers' Committee. And so the decision on BAE Saab was made. The Secretary to the Defence Force at the time, a gentleman by the name of Pierre Steyn, who was the most senior civilian in the South African National Defence Force, said privately at the time, and subsequently went public before my committee, that the Air Force had made it clear that they would only accept the BAE Saab planes if forced to do so by the politicians. So why this insistence on BAE Saab, where the equipment provided was clearly not what even the Air Force wanted? And it's worth bearing in mind that according to figures released by the Air Force itself, only 6 of the 28 planes bought are operational. 6 of 28. Now, trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the people involved, one could argue that the ANC owed both the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, which had recently come into office when this procurement took place, and the Social Democratic Party, or Socialists as they call themselves, in Sweden, that they owed them politically, because both parties had provided significant political and financial support to the ANC.